What started as a dream is turning into a nightmare. The 2024 season has hit a new low for Verstappen and the Red Bull team. After winning 7 out of the first 10 Grand Prix, the Dutchman is without a win in 8 races, with his team often dropping behind McLaren, Mercedes, and Ferrari, sometimes making them the 4th fastest car out on track. How is it that the team is falling apart, the car is a monster, and the championship is under threat? Let's explore how the most dominant team in Formula 1 history has fallen so far from the heights of last season. Because nobody could have seen this coming. The team that won 21 out of 22 races last season, and even began this season by dominating the field, winning by huge margins in Bahrain, Saudi, and Japan, just to name a few, dropping as far as occasionally being the 4th fastest team out on track, is still staggering to me. Looking at Max Verstappen's results at the early part of the season, it felt like it was going to be a continuation of last year. He was winning pretty much every single Grand Prix that was put in front of him, outside of a DNF in Australia that could happen to any team. And even Sergio Perez at the beginning of this year was picking up really consistent podium finishes. And I know that you can move forwards now and say that it's strange to think of 5th and 6th place finishes as absolutely awful, but it just goes to show how dominant they were 12 months ago. However, the first warning signs that maybe this domination might come to an end was thrown in Red Bull's direction in Miami. Although McLaren and Lando Norris won the Miami Grand Prix due to a nicely timed safety car, we started to see the beginnings of the upgrade trajectory that McLaren were on. And we also got the first rumblings from Verstappen that maybe everything inside the car wasn't going as well as the results made it look. He said after Miami, "Today was just a bit tricky. I think already on the mediums it didn't feel fantastic. We were pulling away, but not like we should be. Then once we made the pit stop and I heard what lap times the McLarens were doing, I was like, wow, that's pretty quick. But if a bad day is P2, I take it. However, a bad day is no longer just P2 or even P3. With Verstappen being off the podium in 5 of the last 8 Grand Prix weekends. And as much as you can argue that he was probably in contention to win in Austria, since then there hasn't been a race that I think he's been favourite to win. Maybe Belgium without the penalty, but even Sergio Perez's results have absolutely plummeted post-Miami. What I'm trying to get at is even though since Miami the car hasn't been at its best, the quality of Verstappen has allowed them to win a few more races, pick up a few more podiums, and he's been able to limit the damages to his championship lead. But Red Bull as a whole have now been outdone by McLaren in 8 consecutive events, dropping them behind the Papaya team in the constructors' standings for the first time this regulation cycle. But what's more worrying is the margin of those defeats since the summer break. Considering, remember, Red Bull brought an upgrade in Hungary. So let's take a look at the 4 races since the summer break, starting with Max's home Grand Prix in Zandvoort. And it couldn't have been a more generic race. One-stop strategy, mediums onto hards, and even though Lando was stuck behind Max for the first 17 laps of the Grand Prix, as soon as he's released, the lap time gap between the two is just clear to see every single time around. In fact, in the 55 laps that Lando Norris was ahead, Max managed a faster lap than the Papaya car only twice. It's a complete 180 on what we've expected to see from Max Verstappen and this Red Bull car in recent years. Even at the start of the season, as I mentioned before, Max was winning in Bahrain, Saudi, Japan, and China by comfortable margins. And over the last 2.5 seasons, it's Verstappen that's ended up 20 plus seconds ahead of the rest of the field. So Zandvoort was a shock, but Monza was the real crisis moment for Red Bull, with the team's car being clearly 4th fastest out on track in qualifying compared to the McLarens, Ferraris, and Mercedes cars, and Max's best time in qualifying still being 7/10 off Lando Norris's pole position time, leading to Max Verstappen coming home in 6th place in the race. And that was only thanks to a little help from George Russell and Oscar Piastri colliding at the start. Monza felt like a turning point in the season, a moment in time that made everyone sit up and realise the reality of the situation that Red Bull found themselves in, with 8 races still to run after Monza and the 2025 season on the horizon under the same regulations that they just seemed completely and utterly lost in. Christian Horner has even addressed that, saying, "I'm taking Monza as the low point, and we're starting to build out of that." Looking back at Monza, the car was understeering so much that it was basically undrivable, and then when they opted for the reverse strategy, starting on the hards, going onto the mediums later, the tyres were graining so much that they couldn't actually go long enough in the first stint to make the difference when it came to the tyre offset at the end of the race compared to their rivals. And then the cherry on top of that was that Max Verstappen had issues with his energy deployment running out at the end of the long straights, curbing his top speed on a track that is all about aero efficiency and straight line power. There were a lot of issues to address. Verstappen summed up his weekend by saying, "It's really bad at the moment, and before Baku, we have a lot of work to do to basically change the whole car." So why has this happened? Well, Christian Horner's mask slipped a little after the Italian Grand Prix when he said, "I think that recent upgrades, whilst it's put load on the car, it's disconnected the front and the rear. We can see that our wind tunnel doesn't say that, but the track says that." And that's definitely been repeated by the drivers. After almost every session, Max and Checo are always saying that the balance of the car just isn't quite right, and any change that they make doesn't seem to fix that. What they mean by this is that the balance of oversteer and understeer through the various corners of a track isn't what the drivers are expecting. The front and the rear of the car don't go round the corner as you expect them to, and act unpredictably lap after lap, losing the drivers time as they fight with the car and stop it from sliding through the corners, which is something that Sergio Perez has been complaining about for the longest time. Perez said it was very hard driving into the corners not knowing what it was going to do. It's really difficult to maximize your performance. But he also said some of the engineers after Monza came to me and apologized in a way, because now it's a lot clearer the issues I was talking about. They finally realized that by adding more and more downforce and upgrades to the car, the team was also making the car worse and worse to drive, leading to very unhappy drivers who couldn't corner the car. So you can understand why Max Verstappen wanted a complete overhaul before Baku. But how have those changes that Max Verstappen was so in need of gone in the two races since what the team was hoping would be their lowest point? I thought it would be interesting to look at the finishing gap between the fastest McLaren and fastest Red Bull in 2023 compared to 2024 to see if there'd been an improvement between Monza and Baku. And as you can see, just across the board, the McLaren car has improved ridiculously since last season. Whereas if you look at Red Bull, they're nowhere near the level of improvement that the McLaren car has got. Baku, unfortunately, due to the different time of year and the track itself being slightly different, is too big of an outlier to really understand what we can gain from that. But if you look at Singapore, it did show improvement for Red Bull, and they got more in line with where the McLaren has been improving since last season. However, because they were visibly stronger in Singapore this year and it was an outlier track for them last year, it's also kind of difficult to judge. So for now, we just have to put the statistics to one side and use the eye test. And to be fair, that reprofiled floor on the Red Bull car seemed to help. Just looking at the onboards and the fact that Sergio Perez put in his best drive in a long time, outside of a crash with Carlos Sainz in Baku, things did seem better. And Max Verstappen seemed a little bit more comfortable in Singapore too. They certainly haven't gotten back to anywhere near the pace that they had in the first 10 races of the season comparative to the rest of the field, and we won't get a real feel for where Red Bull is for the rest of the season until Austin, but there were at least positives. Horner said after Singapore, "We were better in Baku, we were better here. I think the encouraging thing was the car reacted as we hoped it would and what our tools were telling us." And if, as Horner said, the simulator for Singapore seemed to line up with what we saw out on track in Singapore, that now puts Red Bull in a much better situation, especially considering a quirk of this year's Formula One calendar. The 3-week gap from Singapore to Austin opens up a clear window for Red Bull to get back in the factory and focus on development. Everyone at Red Bull can go back to the drawing board, get their car in the wind tunnel, and retrace their steps to figure out where it went wrong and what they can do to improve from now onwards. There is, of course, though, one bald elephant in the room: the departure of Adrian Newey from Red Bull to Aston Martin next year. Even though he can't start working for Aston Martin until 2025, he will be away from the Red Bull team on gardening leave until then. And I don't think there's too much of a connection between Newey leaving and the Red Bull starting to struggle, even though it happened around about the same time, because the first signs of this Red Bull concept having issues came partway through last season when Newey was still heavily involved. But for the first time since 2006, Red Bull are trying to address an issue with their car without the man that put the initial ideas into motion. Additionally, another saving grace for Red Bull is that even though the Constructors' Championship now looks lost, I think McLaren will have enough going forwards to see that through with drivers of Norris and Piastri's quality. Max Verstappen has been papering over the cracks of Red Bull's problems so well this season that he's still the favourite for the Drivers' Championship. And the thing that's really impressed me about Max Verstappen over the last 5 races is that he's always seemed to be in the right place at the right time to nullify Norris just enough. Whenever Max does seem to have a bad weekend in Belgium or Monza or Baku, Max has limited the damages, whilst Lando Norris hasn't been able to capitalise on it fully, because something has also gone wrong for him too. Then when Lando Norris is able to get it all together and is dominant in places like Netherlands and Singapore, Max Verstappen finishes right behind him to keep the pressure on. Although Daniel Ricciardo also had his part to play in the title race during his last Formula One outing in Singapore. And I personally think that Daniel Ricciardo deserved a much better ending to his Formula One career. And I talk about all of that in this video here, so click that link and I'll see you over there.